Dzień dobry Państwu.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of our conference, New Reality Challenges for Post-Pandemic Time for the Cohesion Policy. I represent the Polish Agency for the Development of Entrepreneurship. My name is Paulina Zadura, and I welcome you today. I'd like to welcome the participants of yesterday's meeting conference, and I'd like to welcome the new participants, and I hope that we will have several interesting discussions. So I will be very glad to see you and staying with us until the end of our conference. We will have the discussion panels, and I will open the first one. The first one will be dedicated to research and research under pandemic circumstances, because pandemic has been accompanying us for quite some time. Well, we are talking about post-pandemic time, but yesterday discussions showed us that the pandemic is present in all our pandemic, and we are unable to interpret or talk about the reality, the presence, without actually touching upon the context of pandemic. So I'd like to welcome my panelists. And I have been seeing you for quite some time on the screen, but let me actually introduce everyone. I'd like to welcome Monika Bartosiewicz-Niziołek, the president of the Polish Evaluation Association, but also the person who is part of European Evaluation Society, Network for Evaluation Societies in Europe, or a National Evaluation Academy. Well, I'd like to welcome Stanisław Bienias, president of IDEA Institute and IDEA Rozwój, a person who is very experienced on the other side of and he's very experienced, not just in private sector, but also public sector. I'd like to welcome Anna Karczmarczuk, the president of the Polskie Towarzystwo Badaczy Rynku i Opinii and Ipsos in Poland. I'd like to welcome Urszula Krassowska, who is the representative of Kantar public team that is part of the international research group Kantar, a person who is hugely experienced in research. She was before working for OBOP or TNS. And my last panelist, Michał Woch, I'd like to welcome him. He is the managing director and co-founder of Evalu Ltd, a company that is specializing in serving the public sector with regard to evaluation. So we have gathered today, not me, because I am just representing PARP, but we have gathered a big group of researchers, surveyors, who will tell us about the research, about the service, and how that works today, and how this will work in the nearest future, how important are the service and research also for administration and public sector. And then I would also like to talk about how the pandemic affected this industry, and then a key subject. So what will be the future of the research in terms of tools and subjects in the future? So these are our three areas for today. And my first question relates to the questions that are asked today. So business, what questions are asked by business? And well, then, so what kind of answers are sought after? That's the question for Anna Karczmarczuk and Urszula Krassowska. And then we will pass on to the needs of administration, and that will be the question for Stanisław Bienias and Michał Woch. And in the very end, I would like to ask Monika Bartosiewicz, what is the perspective of individual researchers and surveyors? So what kind of questions do they receive? So this is our first subject topic today. And now I give the floor to Anna Karczmarczuk. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me today to participate in this panel. And now, as regards research during pandemic for business and the data, then we may ask ourselves the question about how the access to data has changed in the recent year and a half. Well, the access to data has not changed significantly. I really liked yesterday, I really liked to hear a message about data that is a new currency in the innovative economy. Data about behaviors, about society, about people, about consumers. Well, the situation is similar to what was happening before pandemic, because we have to say that before the pandemic, we've been using different sources of data, not just data that comes typically from a marketing service or opinion polls. These were, for instance, data about behaviors. So, well, the first weeks and months of pandemic were difficult, and we weren't doing as many surveys, but that has changed very quickly, and it just passed. Well, we will definitely be discussing the access to a respondent, but it's very interesting to think what kind of answers are looked for by the business. Well, I would list three, and in this context, a significant need of knowledge about people, respondents is growing. Well, the management boards are more interested in this data. Well, they want to know more about the consumers, about people, because those behaviors and those needs have changed. And the managers have noticed that there is a need to place their business operations in a bigger context. So all kinds of barometers. This is the information that is very popular. And the other issue relates to the questions asked by business industry, how the needs and behaviors that changed during pandemic, for how long those changes will stay with us? Are they permanent changes? Will they disappear? Are we going to come back to old habits from the time before pandemic, because that greatly affects shaping the products and services, well, the nature of the products or functionalities of the services that are offered. And the third thing that is interesting for the business, this is the approach to brands. Well, the brands that during the pandemic have been assessed as a more reliable source of information than the governments, well, they are facing a big responsibility, because the society's consumers, people, have started to have bigger expectations when it comes to brands and when it comes to responsibility. So this is a big challenge, and a lot of services are done there. So thank you so much. And now Urszula Krassowska, over to you. Could you share your perspective with us? And unfortunately, we cannot hear. Thank you so much for inviting me today. Well, I would like to say that the research companies, just like the whole business, they had to get used to the pandemic situation, because just like the rest of the business, we were not really prepared for that. And the situation of the lockdown actually moved us away from the everyday life. But as I said, well, we very quickly get used to the situation, and we have been doing a lot of surveys, a lot of barometers, a lot of measurements have been done, because we were interested in how the society is dealing with the situation. Now, about the questions asked by the business industry, well, it is always the social context is very important, the community context. So the questions about the brands, about the decisions taken in connection with the products, how will they locate, how they will be perceived by the society, and how will they function in the everyday life of the consumer. So there was a lot of interest in learning how the consumers will change their behaviors because of the pandemic and in the new circumstances. How will that change for consumers and also manufacturers? But later on, we've come across issues and questions on how the workers, employees deal with the situation of home office, working remotely. And we were actually thinking ourselves how to deal with the situation, how our surveyors should deal with it, and then how, what are the best solutions that could be applied in such situation. So there were many subjects that we've reviewed, and this process has not stopped yet, because the subjects are still applicable, because pandemic is still with us and it will most probably stay with us for a long time. So those issues, those topics are still applicable. So health, mental health, more and more emphasis is given to those issues. And pandemic actually stressed certain elements of our lives. And before pandemic time, they were sensitive subjects, and we didn't really want to discuss them, but also new issues appeared, such as the willingness to get vaccinated and monitoring of such subjects. Thank you so much. Well, I've been asking about the business because administration often actually checks what business is doing and the flexibility of operations. The administration is looking for good practices that they can actually apply in their everyday operations. But now the questions to Stanisław Bienias. How the administration behaved during the pandemic time? Were they asking the questions in how the entrepreneurs will deal with the situation, or maybe there was a need to check how our support instruments are effective in this situation? How do we behave in this situation? So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. Well, the world has changed very dynamically during the past year. Well, that is not a doubt. Well, this year I can see the light in the tunnel. Last year I did see the light in the tunnel, but it was more like a very quick train, Pendolino, that was running towards me very fast. So when the first wave hit us, then suddenly, from my perspective, the person who is managing a research company, the world has stopped. Administration didn't know how to act. I remember our discussions with my colleagues in the spring last year, well, that we were actually doing everything, whatever tenders we won were continued, but then we didn't know what would happen next. Well, the world has changed and started to operate in cycles of the pandemic waves. If the situation was more relaxed, then administration was more relaxed, and then another wave was coming and things were cooling down. But well, I've looked at the data because we are running a monitoring for European Commission how the evaluation service are published on websites. So when we compare the last year of pandemic and the last year before pandemic, so 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, so the demand for service and research is lower at the moment. So what kind of questions were asked? So there weren't many services dedicated to COVID specifically, because evaluation is a long process. So those services were not very frequent, but for instance, PARP right now is running this kind of service or adds components about COVID specifically, but COVID was present in our service actually. So, for instance, even if the ordering parties were not really asking those questions, we were agreeing with them that it's worth to add this kind of question. What is the pandemic and how it affects us? Cultural innovativeness, development and growth of companies. So right now we have a lot of single analysis that are spread across different areas. So right now the good thing would be to do an analysis of those results and see how that worked globally, because those kind of singular informations are there. A lot of deep and conclusions, in-depth conclusions in those areas, but it's really good to wrap it up right now and see what kind of information that gives us. But whatever happened, we all tried to research and how this pandemic affects our situation. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now, Michał Woch, over to you. Share with us your perspective, please. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, my perspective is just the same as Staszek Bienias' perspective. We operate on the same market, and that market depends on the ordering parties, so mostly public administration, and public administration follows its rhythm. So I think that up until today, most of the services were conducted according to the previous plans and scopes. Of course, there were some disturbances in this rhythm of orders because between April and October last year, we definitely had less service, whereas this is actually, it is a very hot period for orders. And it moved last year till December. Well, subjects. Those services were planned very early ahead, much earlier. So they were adjusted to the rhythm of planning of operational programs. So I believe that up until today, on the level of the scope of pandemic, this threat, this subject was not very popular in terms of a single subject, but it was part of every discussion or survey, well, regardless of the form of the survey. But for the past weeks, we've been actually seeing a big demand or popularity of the service on the pandemic, and they differ. Actually, they research and check how pandemic affects a certain part of reality, and those surveys are ordered on the regional level.
It seems to me that the impact of the pandemic on the reality, on programming, will increase in the context of ex-ante evaluations that are now starting to appear. I know that they are not obligatory in this programming period, but certainly the MAs which planned ex-ante evaluations will require the evaluators, the evaluation companies to reliably review the impact of what happened within the year or 18 months on all the elements that are the basis for programming, from diagnosis through the needs to the goals to the detailed interventions. And in this context, it seems to me that ex-ante evaluations can contain a relatively big component of a service of potential beneficiaries. This seems to be quite an interesting element. Understanding the situation of the potential targets of support. At the stage of diagnosis, it can be a bit too early in terms of access to data, but at the source with the potential beneficiaries, we can look for fresh, updated information about the needs. Thank you so much. It also seems to me that for some time there was this inertia, and plans were implemented in line with plans. But looking at how the PARP functions, we were constantly thinking whether the instruments we currently have on offer, whether they will be of interest still. And it was surprising for us that the interest in support is even greater. But now we realize that analyzing the situation during the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on entrepreneurs is key for planning the whole set of support instruments. And now over to Monika Bartosiewicz. Let me ask you about the perspective of individual researchers and also the opinion of the international circles. Do researchers feel a stronger pressure now? So in times of chaos, we look for answers to existential questions, and we turn to scientists, to researchers, to help us interpret the reality. Do the people you work with confirm this, and who is asking and what are they asking? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting us to participate in this panel. It's very good that we are raising these topics. They are very important indeed. The Polish Evaluation Association, these are not just those doing the research, but also freelancers, smaller firms, one-person businesses. But on the other hand, we also have the representatives of those who order a service. And I want to comment on this perspective as well. I believe it's very important to emphasize that in spite of the fact that we are all part of the big family of social research, evaluation has its specific character. One thing that is different are the clients, like you mentioned. In the case of the first studies, it was mainly the world of business, and in our case, it's mainly public institutions or public administration, but also the third sector, namely NGOs. The second point which my colleagues pointed out, evaluation research is usually planned ahead. It's this huge machinery, and no matter whether we are referring to the level of projects, for example, implemented by NGOs, there was this weakness revealed in the pandemic, namely that we are maybe not very flexible. There are a few ad hoc studies, mainly these are the studies that are planned in advance. So about the topics, we do not see an accumulation of research that would refer to the impact of pandemic. Usually some research questions are added. On the one hand, about the course, the implementation of the various initiatives in the context of the pandemic, but also questions about the impact of the pandemic rather than studies, than entire studies. The change that we see is at the level of research question rather than the entire research projects. On the European level, it looked different, but the main lesson that we learned, well, I'm sorry to say so, but it seems that we wasted the potential of evaluation. I know it's a bold thing to say, because evaluation has this formative function. It was possible to commission research in the course of the pandemic. For example, the world of business did it, but we did not. It's a pity, because had we conducted formative research while observing the process, we would be able to make many things more efficient and have tangible proof, tangible evidence. We could know the status quo. And now it's just post factum. We know what happened. We are learning. We are making conclusions, learning on our mistakes. But unfortunately, it's a bit too late. So this is what I wanted to say to those who order research. Use the potential when something bad is happening, rather than looking at this from when it already happened. Thank you. I hope that all those who might order research projects took this to heart. Before we pass on to the second question, let me say that we also have this poll here, the poll about the future of research post-pandemic, and in a moment there will be a screen with 3 questions. Could you please answer these 3 questions here? And we'll get back to that after further discussion, and we will try to comment on that. So the poll is here, and now I will pass on to the next question. May I ask you for rather synthetic answers, because I believe you already started talking about this. Let's now briefly focus on the research sector. As a sector, like we said, that we know which sectors were the losers during the pandemic. We know which sectors were the winners, and something interesting can be said about each sector. Who did the pandemic help? Which businesses developed and which didn't? So I wanted to ask about the research sector. If you allow me, I also want to divide this question. You may, of course, disagree. You can tell me about the most important experiences you have, but I want to get to the perspective of the freelancers, individual researchers. How did they find themselves in the new conditions when a certain epoch actually ended? And how did they work? How did they develop? How did they develop their tools? So over to Anna Karczmarczuk, then Monika Bartosiewicz, and then we can pass on to the perspective of the organizations. Looking for efficiency in companies. Anna, over to you. Thank you. I think that from the perspective of this year, past year, the research sector, the researchers were well prepared, and they adjusted quickly to the changing conditions, changing very fast. It's also worth emphasizing that we, those who work in this sector, are kind of privileged during the pandemic because we can work remotely. And we did both smaller entities, freelancers, big research companies moved online. The data gathering methods adjusted to the changes that affected us. Anyway, the methods that we are using now have been with us for some time, but we were using them less. Now we are using them more. It's also worth saying that a lot of our work can be done remotely. Data can be gathered remotely, but also quite quickly we adjusted the research protocols as regards the implementation of face-to-face interviews. So they are still implemented in the appropriate sanitary regime. This can be done. And from this perspective, it seems to me that the sector quite quickly adjusted. Thank you. Monika Bartosiewicz, would you confirm what we have just heard? Yes, to a large extent. We have the feeling that we've been prepared for quite long. A lot of our work is done remotely. I'm mainly talking about qualitative research, individual interviewing, group interviewing. This was perceived before. This was perceived as a slightly lower quality, but now this has been actually dispelled. As regards evaluations, evaluation studies, we don't see them as worse studies, and that with different conditions that we could gather more information if they were physically face-to-face. But the question is, were the clients, those who order research, prepared? Some had no problem and started to work remotely very quickly. As regards ordering evaluations, probably there was no problem because this happens remotely. But contracting, in terms of contracting, it was worse. Some institutions found themselves quite quickly, while others needed more time. So we hope that the pandemic will change something. It certainly was a catalyzer for changes, especially for the public institutions. And if we resigned from this now, this would push us back into the past. So some institutions were slower contracting, you said. Why do you think it was like that? Didn't they know how to design a given study or research project, what they can require from the market? And now did you have to teach them that they needed to change this? I don't have the full knowledge about this. I talked about the colleagues from our association. Probably quantitative research, in-depth quantitative research would need to be conducted. But from what I know, there were some administrative obstacles, like switching to remote contracting. Some signatures were needed before this was done on paper, and then that was impossible. I see, says the moderator. And now over to Urszula Krassowska. Could you tell us about the perspective of businesses of your company? do you have any good practices? Did you change anything because some practices were bad? Or maybe you mentioned earlier that actually the research sector was prepared because they had numerous tools. So did the pandemic further enhance digital transformation in companies? As regards research firms, like Ania said before, we were prepared. We were prepared because we worked on digital tools. So we used this type of approach in qualitative studies. The situation of the pandemic accelerated this process and in a way forced us to look for new digital solutions. As a research firms, we had to reformulate our work, which certainly required some effort, but I can say that it worked quite well. We succeeded. As regards the aspects connected with data gathering or some new procedures, we used the solutions that were introduced long ago, but they took more meeting. We managed to convince the clients that online research, both qualitative and quantitative, has a similar or even better value than traditional face-to-face research. But I agree with those who spoke before me that some clients are rather traditional in their approach, and it's hard to switch them to other forms of data gathering, to a different approach. Some difficulties appeared. We'll probably be elaborating on that, but some problems with obtaining data due to limitations connected with the situation in the world of business. I mean, research conducted among businesses because of the situation that we experienced. The businesses started to work remotely, and sometimes it was very difficult, or sometimes even downright impossible, to contact respondents. This was this was really difficult, but now we are managing to sort things out, and we are getting back to the pre-pandemic mode. Face-to-face research, there was a break, but it's coming back. We used some procedures, appropriate procedures, we implemented them, and we managed to get back to this type of research within quite a short time. After 2 or 3 months, such research was restarted. There were situations where respondents during the lockdown were more eager than before to answer the questions that we asked them. They were more open to take part in all sorts of research. Thank you so much. I'd also like to ask Michał, Woch, to answer this question, to show the participants, to the attendees, which social groups are now more difficult to reach, which respondents are now more difficult to reach, so that as the administration we know these limitations and can find for new ways of reaching the respondents.
Well, I hope that you meant me. You asked this question for me. Yes, that was the question for Michał. Thank you. Well, the evaluations are specific kind of service because we have the representatives of generally defined administration or beneficiaries. In both cases, we are talking about people who usually, for many reasons, feel obligated to contact and participate various types of interviews. Well, apart from logistical issues, so location, because in given week or day, they are not in the office but at home. Well, the research was completed after the first month of getting used to the situation. Research were conducted very efficiently. Well, the fact of remote research helped us to actually accomplish our goals, tasks. Well, the public administration, the ordering party here, did not prefer it. Well, they felt that maybe those services were not so reliable, maybe they are more difficult to control. So there was the aspect of quality in research. But I hope that the year of research with metadata convinced the ordering parties that those methods are just equally good, or maybe sometimes even better, because in evaluations, when we have to ask the question to an institution, the methods, remote methods, help us to actually spread in time the data collection process, and that makes the information more complete. Let me give you an example. So if we are contacting a company or a beneficiary from the institution, for instance, or we want to actually talk to the representatives of the managing authority or implementation authority, we contact them about an intervention, and we ask how this intervention is unraveling in this situation. And this is not in the head of one person only. This is dispersed, this kind of information, and actually spreading in time the process of, for instance, filling in the questionnaire and organizing the different kinds of interviews. Also in bigger groups helps us to be precise in determining what is the actual status to collect the data. And with this type of data, it is easier to do it. And Michał actually brought us to the third question that I would like to dedicate to methodology. And we've been talking about that since the beginning of our panel. So remote service or interviews conducted remotely. So not just the researchers who work remotely, but also remote data collection. And I wanted to continue the subject and ask Staszek Bienias to comment about it. And then I will pass on to the business. And in the end, I would like to touch upon reliability. This issue has been noticed today, but it seems to be crucial. So we have to convince, we have to have a hard knowledge about how the techniques will work out to deliver us reliable result. So I'll start with Stanisław. Please give us your thoughts. Well, continuing the previous statement of my colleagues, Well, we've heard why administrations differ, why some are quicker, some are slower in adjusting to the situation. This is a flexible approach, and the openness to modify law, for instance, how the public procurement law matches the reality. So the COVID laws introduced some flexibility, and administration was able to modify some of the things and, for instance, conduct some tenders, some public procurement procedures remotely. Those that were started already, there was a huge jump in documents, electronic documents flow. That was a huge thing from my point of view, and I really pray that we won't lose it because we are not cutting the trees first and then produce paper that is unnecessary. Everything can be done electronically, and the courier does not have to, the mailman does not have to actually deliver it. So my request, my kind request to you is not to waste it, because what I'm afraid is that when the pandemic finishes and so everyone comes back to business as usual, and we will again start using paper, we will have to go and to really see the respondent, because face-to-face interview is so much better than the remote interview. This is a sort of fetish that has developed in the course of research, and it's not true. So I hope that we will not come back to the situation as it was before, because the whole effort of pandemic, the civilizational jump should not be wasted. And the pandemic showed us that there are many methods that can be as good or even better when used remotely. Well, for instance, quantitative methods can be a little bit difficult here, but when we are talking about phone surveys, well, it may be problematic to reach the office because people are not in the offices. But when we talk about qualitative methods, well, there are a lot of advantages. During pandemic, we did a lot of in-depth interviews. When we were actually seeing somebody for an interview, we had to be there at the time, and everything was set. And sometimes actually we have interviews that last for 2 or 3 years. People say that I have to do something very quickly. Can we meet again in half an hour and continue this? So often we are able to conduct in-depth research meetings, panels of experts, something that was a nightmare always. Nightmare to actually be able to invite 5 or 6 experts who are very busy people to join the meeting. It was always a challenge. It was always a difficulty. Now it's not a problem because they don't waste time for the journeys, because the journeys to reach the specific location, this is a waste of time, for instance, because they have to take a 3-hour-long train journey to reach the place. And now the panels of experts are working so well. We can actually bring together experts from around the country, and these are very lively discussions. FGIs, well, we have to moderate those a little bit better and manage it differently, but it's easier to organize this kind of meetings, results meetings. Well, usually we had 15-20 people. The research team was coming, they were wasting time, and right now the whole research team is joining the meeting, but we also have not 20 people, but 70 or 100 people participating in the meeting, and people are able to actually learn about the results. And I hope, I pray that after the pandemic, we will not go back to life as it was before, and we will continue the remote research. I agree. Sometimes the physical interview works better. Sometimes it's better to meet with the respondent, but leave this to respondent, let them choose. But I can't really imagine the situation when next year our respondents are so used to doing remotely, they don't even have office because they gave it up, and they say that they won't like to hear that we have to see them physically, face to face, because they will prefer the remote meetings. It's more efficient and quicker. And some respondents will still have some problems or fears about pandemic. If not this one, then the next one. And some will not really want to see Staszek face to face because he is spreading viruses by running from one person to another. They will prefer to stay at home where they feel actually safer and they are more open to talk and the conversations that we have are more honest. So I'm really worried that we may come back to what the situation as it was before pandemic. So that the effort of pandemic will give us a return on the civilization jump that we've made. And I hope that we will be able to work more flexibly to match the preferences of the respondents instead of following rigidly what has been put in the document. And I hope that the documents will not stay in paper flow. So that's the most important thing, that we do not step back. So thank you so much. Let me add this also. Before the meeting, we talked about the remote technologies, if there are requirements about geographical spread of the respondents. Before, it was so much more difficult. And as you've mentioned, for instance, the meeting of experts that have to take long train journeys. Well, the same situation was when we were looking for people from different parts of Poland. So those technologies help us to save time and money. Okay, we have been talking a lot about conditions for the research, and in this discussion we can hear that with the help of pandemic, we as the ordering party, we are forced to trust more remote research. You confirm that this is something that comes with a lot of advantages, but we also have this trend of digital transition and obtaining information from different sources and in different ways. And I have a question to Anna Karczmarczuk and Urszula Krassowska. In your opinion, or maybe in your companies, what do you offer to business? What are methods that are interesting to business? Or maybe they are just interested in the answers to the questions. And what's the situation in connection with pandemic? So what are the changes? Did the technologies change? So face-to-face interviews became electronic remote interviews. Is it the main breakthrough, or maybe something else happens in different areas affecting the methodology of research? Let's start with Anna. Over to you. I believe that two issues are important here. First of all, during this year, we were able to introduce in the portfolio of our services the solutions, technologies that were not so frequent before the pandemic. And the previous speakers actually talked about that a lot, so I will not repeat that. But what that offers us, it offers us a lot. We have more possibilities to gather, to collect data, to ask the questions and find the answers to the research questions. We have now more methods without the compromises in quality, because the quality of data collection, the quality of data that we have Well, regardless of the methods of data collection is used, this quality is good, but it is worth to say what's the advantage to us or to our customers. Well, that makes it possible for us to do things quicker, more flexibly, and this is something that business expects even more than before. And more often, the ordering parties, our customers, have this message. You have to be quick in making mistakes. Well, we have to provide even quicker the responses to business questions. And everything that has happened during the past year makes it possible for us. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to hear a similar perspective from Urszula Krassowska. Yes, according to me, it's very important that we do not waste the advantages of the pandemic, the benefits that came with the pandemic, because as Staszek has said, we were able to actually switch into electronic signatures and documents. Well, I remember the story from many years ago. TNS company was filing an offer for Eurobarometer to European Commission, and my colleague who was responsible for it, he made a picture of a room full of 39 huge boxes of documents from all member states. Well, that actually shows us that this progress, because we have to call it this way, is necessary, and it is much needed. And of course, our customers are right, of course, but the introducing remote techniques in the quantitative research, this is something that will benefit our customers, because if you want to watch the focuses, you don't have to go to Pacanów or anywhere else. You can just see the respondents on the screen. Well, there may not be 10 people as you write it down in your specification that the focus group must contain of 8 to 10 people. It's not about the small screens and displays, but if we have 4 or 6 people during the 2 hours, they will deliver us so much material that all problems will be perfectly described. So these are the details that have to be emphasized. Well, I've noticed that in the questions we've heard that nothing can replace face-to-face in opinion polls, because opinion polls via face-to-face on interviews have their own limits. Phone interviews come with some limitations, and online panel interviews come with some limitations. And we could actually organize another conference to talk what are the advantages and disadvantages of various approaches to data collection. So it always should be, we should always match the technique and the research problem that we want to solve. And please believe us that we want to show you the best solution. Thank you so much. And now I would like to end this question with the information on the reliability of the data. And now I'd like to summarize this issue, but I'd like to ask Monika Bartosiewicz to wrap it up, how all those changes affected the reliability of research. Well, actually, give me the let me give you the answer that is very popular. Well, it depends. It's not about doing all research remotely, but we have to ask ourselves whether face-to-face will give us better results. Will that affect the value, research value? So Staszek showed the very in-depth picture of the situation in research. Let me add few elements: time saving, cost saving, organizational issues, but also on the side, on the part of organizers. So coming back from the research, we are unable to focus on in-depth analysis of data. We can actually move on to the analysis right away. So that was actually the problem before, that the analysis was often very shallow. We spent more time on collecting the data, and sometimes there was no time to actually analyze them very thoroughly, and with the help of this we will have more time for that.
The second point is because we can conduct interviews remotely, we have access to people that were unavailable before. Hardworking people, experts, specialists, managers. Before they refused to take part, and now we can 100% adapt to their schedule. And like Staszek mentioned, we can interrupt an interview and get back to this at a more convenient time. They also can give us information after hours from home in the evenings. Before it was unimaginable, but now people even offer to do that. This is really fantastic that we can obtain information from them. We certainly have to be very sensitive to those who will be excluded from remote research. We always have to ask the questions whether we are not excluding someone due to other different factors like digital competence and maybe infrastructure, access to equipment, or internet connection, access to internet. This is another aspect to consider. Looking from our own perspective, we may forget about this, but there are some people for who remote methods do not work. It was mentioned yesterday that 1 or 2% children could not take part in remote education. But even if the group is small, it can be very important. We don't want to exclude anybody from research. It is also it can also happen that people resign at the very last moment more than before. But we need to be open, we need to be flexible. And the final thing, the competence of those who conduct surveys. Especially in the case of group interviews, this definitely requires a greater involvement of the moderator. It can be a bigger challenge. They have to keep the attention of the respondents. The moderator needs to encourage the respondents to interact with one another, not just the respondent. But this is about skills improvement and learning from experience. Thank you. I wanted to continue on the topic of skills or new types of costs that are appearing in implementation of remote research. Before the meeting, it was said that the intellectual capital of the researcher is most important. So the true contribution is data analysis and the competences of those who analyze the given material. So this stereotypical belief that now things will be done remotely, so it's going to be cheaper, this isn't true at all. But then I thought that even moderators Some of them prefer the face-to-face environment. Others prefer group interviews. The remote world, there are many conditions in this world. Like I also have this feeling today I need to look into the camera, and I have to look at you, so this is kind of complicated. And I wanted to ask you to comment, Michał, maybe you could comment. Did anybody happen in your firms, any adjustments to the new conditions? Maybe some trainings had to be organized for moderators and researchers to make it possible for them to conduct research in the current situation. Thank you. I wanted to add something to what Monika and Staszek said. We use the notion of remote methods. This is quite a broad notion, and I think it's worth highlighting that remote methods were something different 1 or 2 years ago, and they are something different now. Take the in-depth interview. In the past, the in-depth interview or face-to-face, like direct interview, and the alternative, what was it? Telephone interview. Probably we could imagine that the telephone interview with a person who we do not see or never did not see is not the same as talking face-to-face. Today, a remote interview, in-depth interview, is usually an interview on Zoom or Teams, on a platform, a completely different situation. We can see the respondent, we can see the face, we can see we can build the direct contact, and probably similar to personal contact, genuine face-to-face contact. The second point is that participants of remote interviews are already familiar with the remote methods. In the past, if let's imagine in February 2020, we want to invite somebody on an interview using Zoom. This person probably would have no idea what Zoom is. They would have to download it, and then they would feel uncomfortable. They would feel the situation is artificial. This would certainly affect the quality of the interview. After a year of using platforms like we are using now, this became a familiar method, and it no longer creates an additional technological barrier, which makes the remote contact similar to direct face-to-face contact. I believe it's worth bearing in mind that today the remote methods are not what they used to be. And there was a question about the changes in research companies like ours. Like I said a moment ago, before we tried to use the remote methods, we believed that they were good, sometimes better than the traditional methods, but it was more difficult for us to actually do it because the ordering parties were not really convinced about the methods. While today, both we got some practice and better competences using the remote methods, not just the phone, but for example, those platforms that are also visual, and respondents have become accustomed to that, and conducting group interviews, workshops, discussion, expert panels, individual in-depth interviews, or interviews in bigger groups. This is done on Zoom or Teams, and this works efficiently. I think that both parties are happy. Also, the ordering parties, when seeing how the methods are used, how the both parties cooperate, they are becoming more convinced about them. Maybe it's even easier to control the quality, or they can attend such meetings live, or they don't have to read the transcriptions or notes, that they just can just play the recording and see whether they are happy with the result. They can also capture some things that the transcription would not cover. So they can look at the response reaction of the group, at the faces, the body language. So both parties, the respondents and the moderators have become accustomed to the new ways, and also the ordering parties can be involved and have the chance to appreciate the new possibilities. Thank you. In a moment, I'll ask for the results of our short poll, and could you please look at that? And I think the attendees are really interested in the question about the costs. Could you please comment on that? The time and money saved during remote research, will it be reflected in the lower cost of research? Would any of you like to answer? If I may, because yes, actually, I wanted to answer this before, but I forgot to add. The preparation to both remote methods and the non-remote methods take the same amount of preparation. Sometimes even more creativity and imagination is needed when we prepare remote methods. So theoretically, the only saving would come from saving the time that would otherwise be spent on reaching some destination. But when we look at the research as a whole, the cost of the journey cost is rather symbolic. So the increasing the share of remote methods in research will maybe slow down the increase of the costs a little bit, because the costs are growing anyway for various reasons. Take inflation, for example. I believe that the cost of research will be growing. Maybe it will be growing slower thanks to remote methods, but I wouldn't envisage a big revolution here unless in the course of research, as Monika mentioned before, we have more time for analysis, and the time is spent on research annually. So I don't envisage a big change in terms of cost. By the quality of the reports, the conclusions and recommendations can become better. Thank you. Anybody else would like to comment? I can just say that I agree with what Mr. Woch said, and say that the cost of research, this is not just the cost of data gathering. This is less and less the cost of data gathering. First of all, this is the cost, the labor costs of specialized researchers, analysts. Every research project, regardless of the techniques involved, involves a dozen people or several dozen people, and good research cost money in the past, and it's still going to cost money. It is how it is. I believe we clarified the topic of the costs, and now could I have the results of the poll? I hope the panelists can see this too. Can you all see this? Okay, let me read this. Will research techniques we have been using during the pandemic period replace techniques we used before? So face-to-face meetings, 43% said yes, but more said no, and 10% I don't know. I'm quite surprised. So maybe we could have a look at these questions. Is data received from respondents by remote techniques used during pandemic and data received by personal contact? Something is wrong here. Okay, equals, do they have equal substantive value? 33% say that personal contact gives us more value than remote communication. Both methods are good. That's no. Remote communication contact gives us more value than personal contact. Two people agree. That's 3%, and I don't know, we have 8%. So to repeat, equal substantive value, 57% agree. Personal contact has more value, 32%. And may I have the third question? Will changes in methodology applied due to pandemic stay with us after pandemic? So what Staszek asked for, and the other people also supported him. Yes, most changes, 39% agree. Yes, some of the changes or few changes, 59% agree. No changes will not stay with us after the pandemic, 3%. So there is this quite positive approach here, quite positive about the lasting character of the changes. Would any of you like to comment on some of the answers or all the answers? First of all, we do not know who answered, where it is the ordering parties or the commissioned companies. So I have the evaluator's nature. So I would like to learn about the motivations, about the justification of the choices. So there was the question whether the remote techniques will stay. Some people said yes, some people said no, so you don't really know. In the case of evaluation studies, it largely depends on the ordering parties because we don't always have an influence on that. Maybe by promoting the techniques or convincing people that there are situations where they make greater sense. And the second question, so how valuable remote research is? I'm very glad because almost 60% of people said that they are equally valuable. Of course, we need to work on the mindset, on our habits, but let's assume the hybrid approach. Let's not resign from the remote methods altogether, and let's not get back to the situation from some years back, but let's not get crazy and let's not do everything remotely. And will they stay? I would say that to some extent they will, but still, I think this is optimistic that 60% of people say that to some extent they will stay. It will still be good if they will stay, if they stay to some extent. May I comment? This depends on who the respondents were. If the respondents were mostly the ordering parties, this is not a survey or a poll, but the information how it's going to be. Because in the case of public procurement, there is quite a detailed description of the subject of the procurement, and it contains some exemptions regarding the method. So if specifications don't change and if they don't allow remote methods, or if they don't leave this door open, that for the commissioned party, even if we believe that some remote methods are better. In a given case, we still will be unable to offer them because then our offer would be inconsistent with the expectations of the ordering party and would be rejected. So it seems to me that this is my request to the ordering parties. Leave this door open and let the commissioned firms explain why they prefer a given method. Let them justify this. Thank you so much. There are many participants probably who are ordering parties, so we can assume that there is will at every side to take advantage of the positive effects of the pandemic connected with the organization of our work life. This is positive. So let's keep developing our skills in these aspects in remote research. Now, let me ask the last question. We are approaching the end of our panel. And again, back to the pandemic. I'd like you to think, or maybe you already talked with your organizations about it, about the long-term impact of the pandemic, the impact on the society, but also businesses, entrepreneurs. As a result of the situation that we had, will it be easier or more difficult to conduct research? Will every research have to take account of the pandemic? And about the administration, will we be able to efficiently assess the support mechanisms? Because the pandemic disrupted the social and economic life so much. Staszek, over to you.
Well, when assessing the pandemic in a long term and the effect on the cohesion policy, well, this will be disturbed a little bit, but I don't want to say too much about it. Well, it's very easy to define who was affected the most, where the effect will be the biggest, and whatever bad must have happened, happened. And in the coming months, we will be going back to normality. So I don't really want to demonize this in the perspective of the cohesion policy, because the time horizons there are just 9 years. So this additional year for a slowdown caused by pandemic is not that big effect. Some things have slowed down, but let's not stress it too much when it comes to a global effect. How the life has changed? Well, all of our lives have changed. Well, we've talked a lot about optimistic things coming from those changes, but actually I realized one thing. This is the second day of the conference. It's 9 a.m. and I am not immensely tired, because normally after such conference, we all meet together informally. We sit somewhere, we talk, we discuss until very late in the evening or very early in the morning, actually. And this is something that we're missing. And I really hope that we will be able to come back to this reality. And now, moving away a little bit from this subject, let's get vaccinated so that we can meet together during the next conference. And only in this group of people saying let's get vaccinated is not enough, because you realize that very well. You know what is the hard evidence for vaccinations, and in evaluations we can only dream to have an evaluation experiment on several thousands of people. We will not experience this in our lives, but these kind of evaluations were done, and they show that the vaccines are efficient. They work. So I have one more request for you. Please explain it. Please convince those that are unconvinced here. Yet you understand the evaluations and research. You can interpret the data. You can talk about the effects. Well, we cannot just say that somebody suffered from side effects. We have to actually refer it and match it with millions or billions of people that have been vaccinated around the world. So please actually take care of the fake news, convince your friends, convince the people that you know based on the evidence, evidence relating to the vaccines. Why is that? Because we hope that we will have the conference during the second day I will be fighting not to actually have a presentation because I will be too tired of our talks face to face that were conducted the night before. Yes, thank you so much, and I really hope and wish that we will be having this healthy tiredness after the conference, and we are ready for that. We already have the room for that, and we hope to do it soon. But you've mentioned the trends. What are the trends right now? We are talking about evidence-based policy, and the business is looking for evidence in order to know more about the consumer. We are talking about the trend of fighting fake news, which was emphasized by the pandemic because there was a lot of information chaos and a lot of people were simply saying untrue information. I'd like to ask Urszula, because you are informing about trends also during pandemic, and I came across a short information about the situation of women. So women in pandemic, how their situation deteriorated. And I'd like to actually focus on that. During your research, will you focus on important points, elements in each survey, in each research? Will you be interpreting certain occurrences? Will we see the pandemic and the effects of a pandemic in the future service, or maybe the trends that come out of it? I don't know if you could understand me well enough, but I am actually trying to focus on the pandemic in the future research. Definitely, we will be monitoring the situation in our community, our society, with regard to various dimensions. So it would be good when we take every research, regardless of the topic, to ask about some indicators for our well-being, our situation. For instance, the mental health, the situation of women, because being locked inside our homes protected us against the pandemic, but that actually increased some negative effects, such as violence. So it's important to notice various elements of our life that were affected by, or maybe emphasized by, pandemic, and the polls help us, and even if they are conducted for many years, we can observe trends, because only the research without any context, without the benchmark or the comparative opportunity has a limited value. But it has a value, but it is very limited. It's very important to actually benchmark this, to refer to the previous data. And I'd like to appeal for certain flexibility among the customers, because creating queries in a very precise, very specific queries can actually come back with the inability to give proper answer to research problems, because we have to be prepared that many things can surprise us in life, and that was proved by pandemic. So in order to avoid going through this again, in the same way, let's be flexible, let's be prepared for various situations. Thank you so much. And I understand this is also the appeal to me, to the representative of the public administration. And that is also a good reference to the previous, to yesterday's presentation of David Alba, who also mentioned the necessity for flexibility in the research. So we should actually think about that for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, our time is over, nearly over. So I'd like to thank you for this very constructive discussion, for your honesty, and for your appeals, for everything. I think that we need that all, because we are seeing each other, but we are away from each other. And I think that actually helps our participants, our audience to understand you better and see you better. I liked it a lot. I liked our time a lot. I hope that it was very inspiring for our audience. Well, I have one more question. What would you like to read now and write about? But we don't really have time to ask this question. Let's leave it to another conference. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. And at the same time, I'd like to introduce our break. This will be 15 minutes break, and then we will pass on to the next panel with the presentations, and it will be hosted by Monika Rogalińska from the Central Statistical Office. So we will meet again at 10:45. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.